And I think we will begin the program. So I want to say a good afternoon to everyone. My name's Judy Margles. I'm the director at the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education. I do welcome you to today's program, Understanding the Crisis in Ukraine. I'm so pleased that Marat Grinberg, the Associate Professor of Russian and Humanities at Reed College, is with us today. We've had 460 people register for this program. It's certainly a sign of the dismay and trepidation that we've all carried given the events of the past week. So I'm really grateful to Marat for agreeing to talk to us today. I'd like to thank Amber Kurz, Digital Coordinator, for her tech support of this program. At the museum, our mission is to explore the legacy of the Jewish experience and teach the universal lesson of the Holocaust and provide opportunities for cultural conversation. We challenge our visitors to resist indifference and discrimination and to envision a just, exclusive world. And while we're able to offer this event and most other virtual events without charge, we always appreciate any donation that you might be able to make to support our work. March is a very busy month for programming. You're able to find information about upcoming programming, membership opportunities, or donating on our website. As we know all too well, we are at the 3-year mark with the pandemic around the country. In Oregon, we're seeing a lifting of mask mandates and restrictions. It'd be good news, right? But instead, we've all been glued to the utterly catastrophic and painful news about Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We're also reading with awe about Ukraine's remarkably charismatic president, who just happens to be Jewish and the grandson of Holocaust survivors. I would imagine too that some of you listening in today have roots in Ukraine or Russia. I have a grandmother born in Kyiv. My older daughter is named for a Holocaust survivor from Lviv. Heartache and confusion reign for all of us. I'm incredibly grateful that Marat Grinberg is taking time today to offer his insights and analysis of the situation. Marat grew up and immigrated to the United States in 1993. We're posting his full bio in the chat to keep as much time as possible for his comments and your questions. So I've invited Marat to begin by helping us frame the situation. I have some questions I'll ask him following his opening remarks, but we most definitely questions too. So please do put them in the Q&A tab. So Marat, thank you so much for being here. I'm just going to invite you to take the floor, offer some insights to all of us, and then we'll ask some questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Judy, for having me. I always love to speak at the Oregon Jewish Museum. I do wish it were a different occasion, but it's heartening to see so many people joining in, and my students. It really is amazing to see that. You know, I'll say from the beginning, I'm not a political scientist or a military analyst, and the situation on the ground is so volatile and horrific. But I will welcome any questions regarding what is going on. What I can do is provide personal reflections and I hope insight into what and why this horror is happening. And as I was preparing for today, I was sort of interrogating myself about my identity and what it consists of and what it means. And and I've kind of come up with this list. So I'm a Soviet, Russian-speaking Ukrainian Jew, and of course, on top of all of that, I'm an American, and each of these components is very meaningful and also complex. As a historian of literature, culture, and film, I seek answers in the past invariably. But what I'd like to say from the outset is what is happening now is fundamentally not about history. Putin's regime wages a criminal, inexcusable, unprovoked, manufactured war, which is a catastrophe for Ukraine and most likely a suicide for Russia. Part of what Putin is doing is, of course, distortion, manipulation, and simplification of the past. And I will touch on some of on some of that in my remarks, and hopefully once the questions start coming in. I also have to say the fact that my father lives in Ukraine makes it especially personal and traumatic. And just yesterday, a friend of mine, who was my very close friend in childhood and youth, we were at the same school for many years in Ukraine, and he now lives in New York. And he called me up just to kind of check up on me. And he said, I recall all these stories from my grandmother, and I knew her very well, about being evacuated, in 1941. From Ukraine and getting on that last train, and I grew up with some very, very similar stories from my grandparents. So seeing what is happening is truly bizarre and deeply, deeply painful. So I'll start with the personal. My long and deep ancestral roots are in Ukraine, in the Podolia region, and I will share my short PowerPoint just to illustrate. Can everybody see? Hopefully. This is right by near our house in Beaverton. I was touched to see that somebody put up "Support Ukraine" and Ukrainian flag. But so here's in yellow is the Podolia region, where my family comes from, and I was born in the city of Kam'янets-Podilsk in Ukrainian, which is an ancient Ukrainian city with a very rich and traumatic Jewish history, and a city that also means a lot to me because the film Commissar, which was made in 1967, was shot in Ukraine, and I spent a great deal of my scholarship on researching this film. And this is a picture from just a few days ago in Kam'янets-Podilsk by the ancient fortress, and you can see Ukrainian soldiers marching there. It is truly horrific and bizarre, but also heartening to see this picture. My family left Ukraine when I was 16 years old, and so I spent my formative years there. And while certainly we were a Russian-speaking family, where Russian literature and culture were treasured, I was surrounded by Ukrainian. My grandparents could speak Ukrainian, and so do my parents. They loved to sing Ukrainian songs, and I was always told by my mother, by my grandparents, that Ukrainian is one of the most melodious languages in the world. My great-grandfather died in the battle for Kiev and is buried in a mass grave outside of Kiev. I studied Ukrainian language and literature all through the years of middle and high school. In other words, it mattered that we lived in Ukraine. It contributed to our sense of being Soviet Jews. And I have to say, my forthcoming book on the Soviet Jewish bookshelf, which reconstructs post-World War II, post-Holocaust Soviet Jewish culture, I think resonates with what is happening today. And I also perhaps will get into it in the Q&A. There were a number of recent pieces by the people that I respect that I think really provided a very simplistic and reductive view of Soviet Jewishness, particularly in relation to the Ukrainian President Zelensky and the Ukrainian Jewish relations. It's also my current project is a translation of my grandfather's memoirs. And my grandfather worked as district attorney in Ukraine for almost 40 years. And I think his stories, his vignettes, really illuminate the Soviet Jewish-Ukrainian triangle. My grandfather was 94. He passed away a year and a half ago. And as horrible as it sounds, I'm glad that he did not live to see what is happening today. It would have been utterly and completely heartbreaking for him, who was also a veteran of World War II. So I think Putin's, and others have said this as well, but Putin's main mistake and miscalculation is that he utterly and completely misses a basic fact. Ukrainians are a separate people, and the dream of restoring the Russian Empire is bound to fail. And one of the clearest and most astute explanations of this comes from Vladimir Jabotinsky. a major turn of the century Russian Jewish writer who would go on to become a key Zionist politician. Jabotinsky, a native of Odessa, wrote an essay called The Lesson of Shevchenko's Jubilee in 1911. And Taras Shevchenko is, of course, the great Ukrainian national poet. When Ukraine became independent in 1991, but the first sign of that in my high school was that the portrait of Lenin on the wall was replaced with the portrait of Shevchenko, and Shevchenko truly embodies Ukrainian national idea. And so I'll just talk very briefly about Jabotinsky's essay, because I think that essay should be a required list for a required reading for every single Russian. It is incredibly relevant today, and the fact that it comes from this Jewish thinker is truly significant. So Jabotinsky writes that Russians cannot understand why would Shevchenko, that they say is a talented poet, stubbornly cling to writing in Ukrainian. And he gives this example. He quotes from Shevchenko's very famous poem, and I'll read it in Ukrainian, the beginning of it in Ukrainian. Думи мої, лихо мені з вами, на що стали на папері сумними рядами. And then Jabotinsky said, what if we write this in Russian? And I think even if you don't know Ukrainian or Russian, you'll see how close the words are. So the Russian rendition would be, ах, вы думы мои думы, ах, беда мне с вами, что стоите на бумаге грустными рядами. And the English translation by Vera Rich, oh, my thoughts, my heartful thoughts, I'm troubled for you. Why have you wrenched yourselves on paper in your ranks of sorrow, right? So Jabotinsky says, what's the big deal? What's the big deal? Why stick to Ukrainian when you can easily write this to Russian in Russian? And here's Jabotinsky's explanation. He asks, what does Shevchenko represent? Is it a bizarre curiosity or something much more serious and substantial? And Jabotinsky concludes that Shevchenko is a powerful manifestation of Ukrainian desire to be separate, which is not a whim, but an expression of centuries-old proud, rich, and life-affirming national spirit. And until Russians, and especially Russian intelligentsia, appreciates and understands that, they'll remain blinded to and oblivious of reality. And here's a quotation from Jabotinsky. Shevchenko is a national poet, and therein lies his strength. He is a poet nationalist, even with all the defects of a nationalist, with the outbursts of wild animosity toward a Pole, a Jew, other neighbors. But what is more important is that he would remain a luminous precedent, which would not allow Ukrainians to divert from the path of their national renaissance. To celebrate Shevchenko is to understand and accept that there is no and cannot be a unified culture in a country where more than 100 nations reside. To understand, accept, move aside, and give a legitimate place to a mighty sibling. And this is written in 1911, and I think you can appreciate how deeply relevant and powerful these words are. And look, it is very significant. Jabotinsky does not deny that indeed there is animosity in Shevchenko toward Poles, toward Jews, toward Russians. That's part of the game. But what is truly significant is that it symbolizes, exemplifies this Ukrainian desire to be its own people. And for me, this was a very powerful lesson. I was reading this essay along with Jabotinsky's other writings when I was still in Ukraine, and I was rediscovering my own Jewishness. And what it taught me, that a lesson indeed in my own Jewishness, and the not always easy ability to respect another's identity, even in the face of very difficult and bloody history. And finally, what I'll say, this leads us to the question of Ukrainian Jewish coexistence. And it certainly has many very dark pages, but also has some redeeming ones. From an attempt at establishing a multi-ethnic Ukrainian state in 1917, where Poles and Jews and Russians would have been given a cultural autonomy. This attempt was thwarted by radical Ukrainian nationalists and Bolsheviks, or the righteous Gentiles who saved Jews during the war. I grew up with those stories. Or some Ukrainian dissidents who wanted to preserve the memory of the Holocaust. And finally, I'll say it's up to Ukrainians to sort out their past and come to terms with it. And we can point to some troubling aspects of that process and some inspiring ones. And again, as I said, again, what is happening now is about what's happening now, right? History matters, but the crime that is being committed today is what's truly important. But to reflect on these inspiring pages of what is happening in Ukraine today, as far as the past and the coexistence with Jews is concerned, there is certainly a new generation of Ukrainians, and some of them are my friends, and I see their openness to the world, openness to the West, and indeed the desire to come to terms with some of the troubling aspects of Ukrainian history. And of course, the fact that the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, is a Jew, a Soviet Jew. And I was just telling Judy before we started, Zelensky is just a year younger than me. We come from very similar backgrounds, and I sort of understand where he's coming from. And again, I hope we can get more into that today in the Q&A. The main thrust of Russian propaganda, this idea of the denazification of Ukraine, which Putin just insisted on a few hours ago, comes from manipulating the history of World War II, and the Jewish component does play a role in it. And of course, the fact that Babi Yar, the place where 34,000 and more Ukrainian Jews were massacred, was hit by the Russian shell, is truly a devastating symbol of what's happening. And Zelensky spoke about it yesterday and did a special Hebrew translation of his talk for the Israelis and the Jews worldwide. So that's what, and just I wanted to finish with these two pictures that just came, and I think the most recent one is the people praying at the Western Wall wrapped in Ukrainian flags, and then this Ukrainian soldier who's praying in the synagogue, an observant Jew. It is that's truly redeeming to see, and I think this perhaps indeed will be that healing moment in Ukrainian Jewish coexistence. So that's what I wanted to say preliminary, and now I'll be very happy to take any questions.
Marat, thanks so much. A lot of what you said was utterly heartbreaking, but we are really grateful that you were able to share these insights. I will just start off with a question. You know, for some of you who know me, I've been on this real crusade to make sure that people are not analogizing contemporary suffering with something that took place during the Holocaust. But it's so clear to me that, and of course others, Timothy Snyder has said this, that there are direct parallels that we can make between Hitler's invasion of Ukraine, Hitler's invasion of Poland in 1939 and Putin's invasion of Ukraine. So if you could speak to that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and I also have always been very cautious about making these parallels, but I think there certainly are certain parallels in in what Putin has done. The fact that it is an unprovoked war completely, and the fact that he is using this pretext of defending the Russian-speaking population, the ethnic Russians in Ukraine from persecution or from genocide, according to him. So it really does invoke parallels with what Hitler and the Nazis were doing, and it's and of course there are differences, drastic difference between the Nazi ideology and the view of Ukrainians, Slavs as subhumans, sub people, and Putin's imperial understanding. Again, this is precisely what Jabotinsky was speaking to, right? This inability to accept the fact that Ukrainians are a separate people, not a younger brother that needs to be taken care of, right? Not the same people, right? Even though there are incredibly significant commonalities, right? I always kind of think, what is happening now would be tantamount if California was bombing Oregon, yeah? But Putin just cannot accept this fact of Ukrainian desire to be separate. And what is truly also horrific is that, whatever goodwill there was on the part of Ukrainians toward Russia has utterly been wiped out, and justifiably so, right? So any rapprochement, I really don't know how it will happen, but it is devastating on a personal level. There are so many families, where you have a family member living in Russia and a family member living in Ukraine. There are just so many of these ties. But to get back to your original question, indeed, I think there are certainly parallels in their thinking, in their tactics, and the fact that both wars that Hitler started and Putin started are utterly criminal. And as Russia is increasing its offense, we understand that war crimes are being committed, and civilians are getting killed more and more day by day. And so, yeah. This kind of, there's so many caricatures now in the, that appeared in the remaining, liberal Russian media, and which is being completely shut down by Putin. And in Ukraine, Putin as a baby, being driven by his parents, Hitler and Stalin. That there's a lot of meaning there.
And I really appreciated, your reflections on the community that you grew up in and the Jewish community. Can we talk a little bit about the contemporary Ukrainian Jewish community? Of course, there were 2.7 Jews in that area that was, today called the Ukraine before the Holocaust. 1.5 million Ukrainian Jews were murdered during the Holocaust. But I was really surprised. I think I read it first in the New York Times just as the invasion was starting. I think other people were surprised too. 200,000 Ukrainian Jews today. So Tell us a little bit about that community.
Right. The numbers are tricky when it comes to the Jewish population. Of Ukraine. I think kind of the strictest numbers, it's between 40 to 50,000. But if we start counting, families where you have, intermarriages and Ukrainians and Jews, Ukrainians and Russians, then the number kind of becomes much bigger. Of course, a great majority of Jews have emigrated from Ukraine, to Israel, to the United States, to Germany. But still a significant number has remained, and there's certainly a Jewish life in Ukraine. Synagogues, Jewish community centers, Jewish schools, Jewish research that is being conducted. The scale varies. A lot of those who stayed are now the elderly, the impoverished, right? And who are right there also, will be the first victims of all these air raids. And but there is absolutely a Ukrainian Jewish community and a Ukrainian Jewish life, and I think, if you look at contemporary Ukrainian literature, contemporary Ukrainian poetry, Jewishness does occupy a central place in it, from responses to the Holocaust, and other events. So I think, again, despite and I absolutely do not want to overshadow the fact of very bloody and tortured history of Ukrainian Jewish coexistence, there are some truly redeeming aspects that began to happen, and that is why, again, it's so horrific to see what is happening now, and how Russia is, or rather Putin's regime, I say, manipulating that World War II past, and this whole idea of denazification of Ukraine.
And so just thinking about that, Putin, obviously, he sees Ukraine as part of the Slavic Empire, right? And used really really learned a lot from your comments about Jabotinsky and Shevchenko, but if we could think about that a little more, and maybe you could speak in other ways about the deep cultural connections, these literary, cultural connections between Russia and Ukraine. Reflect a little bit about the commonality of these two countries. And are these commonalities, to take it one step further, do you think these connections and the commonalities speak to why Putin's so miscalculated?
Yeah. The commonalities are deep, centuries and centuries deep. The cradle of Ukrainian civilization, and then out of that sprang Russian civilization, is Kiev and Rus. And this is where both civilizations, both nations come from. And again, if you think about Shevchenko, the Ukrainian national poet, who also, he wrote his prose only in Russian. He kept a diary in Russian. He was a serf who was granted freedom thanks to a famous Russian artist, Brylov. And there's so many links between Russian writers and Ukrainian writers. At the same time, we should again say that this kind of imperialist view of Ukraine is also present, absolutely, in Russian literature and in Russian culture. In fact, I just proposed a new course that I'll be teaching next year on Ukrainian imagination and Russian literature that touches on these connections. And I think, again, if you particularly, if you look at the history of World War II, right, where you had the Soviet Union taking up Western Ukraine, which was originally part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ukrainian nationalists, the Ukrainian nationalist army that collaborated at first with the Nazis because they were choosing between the two evils, the Bolshevik evil, the Stalinist evil, and the Nazi evil, right? And the Jews were right there. The Jews were right there in the middle, right? One of the most horrific pogroms happened in Lviv before the Nazis came in, committed by the Ukrainian nationalists. So this is, again, here is that very painful history, very painful past that the Ukrainians have begun to interpret, come to terms with, sometimes successfully, sometimes not successfully, right? But Putin's regime, Putin uses that, and this is where that idea of denazification comes from, right? That the current Ukrainian government is an heir to those Ukrainian nationalists who supported the Nazis in the war, between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. And I was just reading a couple of days ago. So Medvedev, who was also a president of Russia when Putin allowed him to do that for a couple of years, and who kind of thinks of himself as an intellectual, he wrote a piece just last year precisely on that, where he says that we should think of Zelensky, of the Ukrainian president, as those Jews who sympathized with the Nazis, right? So he presents Zelensky as this Jewish traitor, right? So the very fact that he aligns with the Ukrainians and becomes the Ukrainian leader, right? He is that kind of capo figure. So this is the picture that they present to the world, really manipulating and using that painful, traumatic history to destroy, an independent, democratic country in the very heart of Europe.
And someone actually, I think, posted a good follow-up question to my question, which another question is, given these connections, these commonalities, these cultural connections, are there Ukrainians, is there are Ukrainians talking to Russia? Is there any for Ukraine on any of the Russians? They know some of these soldiers who are, coming into their country.
Yeah, no, it's yeah, as I said, I mean, so many families, right, have family members in both countries. You certainly have, the liberal Russian intelligence in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, in other cities, is in complete solidarity with the Ukrainians, and truly fearful that real repressions are coming in Russia. And they have already started. I mean, they shut down the independent radio station, Echo of Moscow, the only remaining independent TV station, Dozhd Rain, shutting down Facebook, social networks. But that's solidarity. Solidarity is absolutely there. And I hope that still, many Ukrainians recognize that, although it's tough when a bomb is flying at you, from a Russian plane, and shells are coming. I mean, it's very difficult, right? And the question of collective responsibilities is a very tough one that, of course, Europe and we've had to grapple with since World War II. But I think it is an important question to consider. As I said at the beginning, I think what Putin is doing is certainly a catastrophe for Ukraine, but it is also a suicide. It is also a suicide for Russia, especially considering the incredible richness and wealth of Russian culture, and the potential that country, that country has. Right? It has turned into a pariah state. Clearly, will become a deeply repressive state. And how Russia can and will recover from that is absolutely unclear. And again, for me, and my friends who are from Ukraine, and at the same time are Russian culture means, language means so much to us and to me, who spent a great deal of my life studying these. Studying everything connected to it is unbelievably painful and horrific, frankly.
Of course. Yeah, I'm glad you hearkened back to your opening comment about this being a suicide for Russia, because a number of people picked up on that comment, Marat, and wanted you to expand on it. I don't know whether there's anything else you want to say. I mean, there are some countries supporting Russia. We saw that at the UN Security Council. Do you think support will increase, decrease?
Yeah, I mean, I think
say more about this idea of suicide.
Yeah, I mean, I think pretty much the entire world is now standing up with Ukraine. What that means practically is a different question, but I think that the scope of solidarity is something also that Putin had not foreseen, and had not expected. Yes, when you had the UN resolution, I think what 5 countries voted against, it was Belarus, which is Putin's not just ally, but doing everything that he wants them to do, and Belarus is participating in the war on Russia's side. I think it was North Korea, Eritrea, and there was another country that I can't think of at this point. So, I think the world is standing standing with Ukraine. One very difficult question to answer, and I've looked at what the experts are saying, and is how much does Putin truly still have support among the Russian population? I mean, it's a huge country. My friends, my colleagues, again, are the ones, in Moscow, in Petersburg, who are in complete solidarity with Ukraine, a great majority of them. That's one story. Another story, again, is what people think in this vast country, particularly people, Russia still does not have a substantial middle class. You still have people who receive their information only from the official channels, which were always, when I was in Moscow in 2019, you turn on that first channel, official channel, and all you heard, and that was 2019, for good, grade of the day, Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. Now, of course, it has increased sevenfold, right? And according to official surveys, there is a substantial support. I think it's 70% or even increased. But the true picture is, I don't know, especially when Russian economy is collapsing. But as somebody pointed out just recently, I saw on Facebook, kind of uprisings, if we're thinking that an uprising can occur in Russia against the regime, sanctions do not cause uprisings. And especially when there's so much fear. And I think what Putin is doing, having just acknowledged that the Russian losses, because originally it's a campaign, right? It's a limited military campaign. They essentially banned the word war. So there were these memes that now we should call Tolstoy's War and Peace, limited campaign and peace. But now, Putin acknowledged there are losses. I think he says 900 or so. Clearly, there is. I think the number is greater. But they're paying the families of the families where the soldiers were killed a pretty substantial amount. I think it's something like $65,000, something like that, if I remember correctly. So that's a very difficult question kind of to evaluate. Right. And but you hear all these stories that, again, people trying to leave Russia, flee, again, mainly thinking about Petersburg, Moscow, and because if he declares martial law, which there is a talk of that, of course, that will mean that nobody can leave the country. Truly horrific repressions can begin. But at the same time, I understand those who are saying, let's concentrate on Ukraine, because Ukraine now is getting hit and hit severely, and people are dying.
So let me pick up on that, since you mentioned sanctions, and there is a question, and I was thinking of a question too, that I think we can celebrate when we hear that a $600 million yacht has been seized, but sanctions that are hurting Russians, not something to celebrate, of course, but are sanctions the right way to go in your mind, even though we know it's hurting friends of yours in the country?
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm not a political scientist, I'm not an economist. Again, and I think, Putin did not think that these truly severe sanctions would be implemented, and they are being implemented, and they are leading to, a collapse of Russian economy, and sanctions stay in place for a long time. And so I think, yes, these are absolutely the right steps. Should they have been taken earlier is a good question. And again, whether they can change in the facts on the ground is difficult, right? I think I was reading a couple of days ago that there are these documents that the people saw, about the Russian plans for the invasion, which they had them back in January, where it says something like, it will take them 15 days to occupy the country. They were expecting that the sanctions would be severe, but then they were hoping that the world would accept the new fact, and the sanctions would be receded. Yeah, I don't think that will happen. I cannot imagine that if let's say, yes, Putin does take Kiev and tries to install a puppet regime, I cannot imagine that the world will accept it. The United States, Europe, I don't see that happening. What the next step should be, I don't know, right? Because I was just reading, Garry Kasparov, who is a great chess player, who was has been a vehement critic of Putin's regime, and now he says more people should have listened to me. He believes that until NATO intervenes in some substantial way, nothing will change. But of course, that brings us very close to World War III, right? And the possibility of of a nuclear event. So I mean, it's incredibly difficult difficult situation.
So,
Yeah.
so maybe the flip question is what happens if Putin fails?
Yeah, but the question is, how will he fail? Again, I think, by all accounts, right? Russia, he's not succeeding, at least as speedily as he was hoping to, right? And that says again about his miscalculations, about the Ukrainian population, about the strength of the country, how unified the country is, how the country is standing with Zelensky, right? And also the weaknesses of the Russian army, which does not seem to be that strong, powerful army, that kind of the image that was provided. So they're not advancing. They're not advancing as as fast as they were hoping to. And of course, again, with the world being really in full solidarity with Ukraine. So, and this idea, again, as I said, kind of being a suicide for Russia. So, yes, I think it is the end of Putin's regime in the long run. The question is how many, he will take with him to that grave. Both in terms of human lives and again, the future of the world. I mean, that's the big question, right? And I always, my impression and the impression of kind of the experts that I trusted was that Putin it's not about ideology, right? He's a practical man, a practical autocrat, which is ultimately interested in grabbing as much wealth as possible for himself. And that was the point that Navalny, the leader of the opposition in Russia, of course, who is now imprisoned, that's the point that he was making. But now we see that it's more than that, right? There is that ideology of restoring the Russian Empire behind it. This deeply kind of dehumanizing ideology that he seems to really kind of believe in and willing to sacrifice everything, right? He just said a few hours ago that he will never, ever accept that the idea that Russians or Ukrainians are now one people. He's just not giving up. He's not giving up on that. And, he seems to be secluded and still probably surrounded by these yes men and, the generals who want to impress him. But it's difficult to read his calculations, all these stories that we've heard. Condoleezza Rice was recently speaking and saying, when she was meeting with Putin, he struck her as smart, astute, kind of cold-headed, practical, and now she says it's a different person. But of course, there are those who were saying this was coming. It certainly started in 2014, with the invasion of Crimea and what was happening in Eastern Ukraine. So it just, it's very difficult to predict how this will evolve. Again, the only thing I find, just to repeat this, that I can say, I don't think the world will accept this status quo. What that will mean practically, I don't know. But I think the world has changed when Germany is supplying, arms to Ukraine. It's significant.
And what about we're getting some questions asking about a potential increase in anti-Semitism. If you think that the plight of the Ukrainian Jews, just thinking of the Jewish community in particular, do you think that is going to increase anti-Semitism worldwide? This use of the word denazification, which for people who don't necessarily understand what he's doing?
I don't think so. I think actually, as I said, I think what is happening now, and truly, with the admiration that the world has for Zelensky, and the solidarity in Ukraine between everybody, I think that could be that kind of healing moment in Ukrainian Jewish coexistence. Yeah, anti-Semitism has really not been, that big of an issue in Ukraine in recent years. And again, living there, I certainly experienced it on a daily basis. I absolutely did. And again, there's some really painful past. And again, as I said, the way that Ukraine has dealt with it has not always been successful. But looking at the new generation, among whom again are some of my friends, colleagues, and I understand that I'm talking about intellectuals, but I see that how they view Jewish history and Ukrainian Jewish coexistence is indeed very different. And I think it's very indicative. I just talked to, just before our talk, I talked to my classmate from Ukraine, and he's near Kyiv. So he's relatively safe. And he's a Ukrainian guy, and he wrote to me. He said, you heard about Babi Yar, and he said there's just this solidarity around that event, and that says a lot. That says a lot, right? That he would pick up on that and tell me about that. So I don't think this will lead to, of course, who knows, I was talking to my son, who's 12, and about all of this and how Zelensky has become this hero, but I said, times change and people quickly forget. If you think about Churchill and what happens to him after World War II, being losing the election. So who knows what the future holds. But I think it is very much a moment of solidarity between everybody, and including Ukrainians and Jews. My father, who is there, and in Khmelnytsky, my native city, he told me that he helped to have the local rabbi evacuated. He's an Israeli guy, Israeli rabbi with little kids, and they were able to get him to Romania, and from there to Israel. And it's also, Ukraine is a huge country, and there are certainly differences between, Eastern Ukraine that was part of the Russian Empire, Western Ukraine that was part of Austro-Hungary, but again, that's a conversation for, I think, for a day when there is peace, and and we can sit around the table and talk about history, but I don't think this will lead to increase in anti-Semitism, neither in Ukraine nor in Russia. Again, I mean, Putin is using that Jewish issue, but it's just not at the center. Yeah.
Thank you. I mean, that was something encouraging, perhaps, that we can hold on to. What about the timing? Couldn't he have done this when Trump was president and possibly gotten support for it? Like, why now?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what figures in his calculations. Again, I mean, I think people were saying that he was going to do this after the Olympics, and indeed he did that. And that picture of him that we all saw, sitting there in his black coat, completely kind of lonely and isolated, watching the Olympics is in my mind, and very telling. Again, if you look at the documents that some people have uncovered, they had these plans for a long time, certainly since January, right? And it was escalating. I mean, it began in 2014 with the invasion of Crimea, which was completely bloodless, and something that Russians supported and enjoyed. Its cheap resorts and kind of historical significance, and the war that was happening in Eastern Ukraine sort of was out of people's minds. So but it was building up. I think because that idea again, that Ukraine does not have a right to be independent, to exist independently, unless there is again that puppet regime there that can do whatever Russia wants them to do, which of course was the case to a large extent before the Maidan revolution. I think the Maidan revolution just triggered something very, very kind of deep and powerful within Putin and those and those around him. So I think there is, it was coming. Yeah, I mean, again, I think I certainly did not think that it would come to bombing Kiev and Kharkov and true invasion. But but it was in the plans. It certainly was in the plans.
There's a very good question, I think, about misinformation and whether or not you see that if there are any common ideological threads in the misinformation that Putin's regime is putting out to the Russians, the Ukrainians, all of us in the West. What are they, if you can identify them for us? And do you think there's a central idea? Is there a historical, a political factor that is the reason why his propaganda is resonating around the world for illiberals?
I think, again, considering Putin's, past, being a KGB, KGB operative, and he certainly, using propaganda for his means is absolutely essential. Again, the main thrust of that propaganda is that Ukraine, has been overtaken by a Nazi junta, by neo-Nazis. They're committing genocide in Ukraine against the ethnic Russians, and they need to be stopped. That's essentially the thrust of the propaganda. Why it's successful? Because you can, in today's world, you can manipulate everything. You can manipulate images. The Russian television was showing a central square in Kharkiv being explosions there, and they were saying the Ukrainians did it, right? And why it resonates in Russia, although again, I think it's hard to see exactly how much support he has, but the reason that it resonates is because of the legacy of World War II. 20 million people, Soviet Union lost 20 million people. The legacy of World War II fighting the Nazis is a tremendous part of everything that Russians and Ukrainians grew up with, right? And so he is using that, right? He's presenting himself as an heir to the Soviet liberators, the Soviet Union that defeated the Nazis, as indeed it did, right? And he is an heir to that. Russia is an heir to that, and Ukraine today is an heir to the Nazis. So that's his game, which again I think mainly resonating among some parts of the Russian population. I don't think it's resonating in the world at all. I mean, again, but history is very complicated. History is very complicated here, and because of the Soviet component and and everything else.
Do you think that, as some commentators have remarked on, that it's possible that some China, India, Israel, they might be able to talk with Putin, persuade him to stop? Do you see anything that makes you have a kernel of hope?
Yeah, again, and I'll leave that to the to the political scientists. I think, again, from my standpoint, what I can see, I think the Chinese are playing, a kind of a tactical game. I mean, they're watching carefully what's happening, and they have not put out an incredibly strong support of what Putin is doing. Neither in the UN, I think they abstained. There was some talk of them joining, with some of the sanctions. So I think they're watching carefully. If Russia begins to succeed, that would be one thing, since they're now not as successful as they were hoping to be. So I think China is sort of carefully waiting on the sidelines and certainly entertaining its own possibilities. People have talked about Taiwan and things like that. India, I really don't know. In terms of Israel, Israel does not have the clout that a country should have in order to be able to bring Putin and Zelensky together. And I also have to add, Israel is in a very, very difficult spot. Some people have said, why is Israel not being more pro-Ukrainian? Israel is in a very difficult spot because of Russia's complete influence in Syria and Iran. And because of that, Israel needed to maintain a pretty close cooperation with Russia, with Putin's regime, because of the threats that come from Syria and the existential threat that that comes from Iran. So Israel is in a very difficult position, and that just in response to those who have said, well, they should do, and they've done a lot with the humanitarian aid, sending in doctors, certainly voting in the UN. But as far as Israel, kind of this idea that they can bring together, have the Jerusalem summit, Israel can't do it. It's just not realistic at all.
I'm just looking at the hour. We are approaching the 1 o'clock hour. There's still so many wonderful questions.
I'm happy to stay long.
Yeah, we'll keep the program running a little more. You're welcome to add more questions, and I understand that some of you may have to hop off now. We've all been reading the stories, one assumes they're true, but of Africans having trouble leaving Ukraine, having trouble getting into other countries. I don't know whether you have any insights about that. And have you heard any stories at all about Jews having problems leaving as well and being admitted into other countries?
I have seen those stories, yes, about the African refugees. As far as Jews, Israel, I think, kind of sort of speeded up the process that the Aliyah process that for Jews to be able to leave Ukraine and come to Israel, and the problem is, how do you get out? Because of course the air is closed, and we've seen now, I think we're talking about now already about 1.5 million refugees, and I mean it's incredibly difficult, and just the effect that will have on the situation in Europe and geopolitical situation is truly catastrophic. One thing I'll add, and I just again thinking about sort of Putin's propaganda is this idea that he's not going to stop with Ukraine at Ukraine. If the idea is restoring not just the kind of the Soviet Union, but it's restoring the Russian Empire, then that means Poland, that means the Baltic states, which is again why Poles in particular have been so forthcoming in their aid to Ukraine, and really encouraging the European Union to accept Ukraine into its ranks. So yeah, I think that's a very significant question to think about, that Ukraine is a stage for Putin. It's not the end.
And you've certainly sort of talked around this, but I'm not sure whether we've actually asked you this question point blank. What support does Putin have in Russia?
Yeah, again, I think that's a very, very difficult question to answer. You can look at the official surveys, and it seems like it's around 70%, 65%. Wow. But of course, these are official numbers that are unverifiable. But again, it's hard to say. I mean, according to some, indeed, there's still a substantial support because of this propaganda, also because people don't know, right? I mean, you have all these stories about these, Russian mothers who had no idea that their sons were in Ukraine and what they were sent there to do. And, the Ukrainians opened up this hotline for the Russian mothers to be able to call and ask about their sons. But the country, Russia, is becoming more and more repressive, and it's more and more difficult to access any honest information. But I certainly see it. Even among some people in Slavic studies, who are absolutely pushing this this Putin's propaganda. Yeah, so I think there's a support. There is a support for what he's doing. How that can, what will break that is difficult to answer, because again, it's just such
Sanctions.
Sanctions, right? But again, there's only so much that they can do, and Russia is a huge country. We always think Moscow and St. Petersburg, which is kind of its own animal, but there's that whole vast, huge country out there,
And do you want to just, I know you're not a political scientist, but you certainly know a lot. And so just, really your own view of, we're getting a lot of questions about why NATO is such a, why can't the Ukraine join NATO? Why is Putin so against that? And similarly, why the EU isn't allowing Ukraine just to join?
Yeah.
Two different questions.
Right. Well, I mean, a few things to say about that. And of course, this idea that NATO is coming closer and closer to the Russian borders, is something that Russia, Putin have been talking about for a very long time. And this is something that a lot of, experts acknowledge that's a serious issue, right? That's a serious issue for Russia. Again, by no means can this be seen as an excuse for invading another country, right? The NATO issue, whatever you think of it, should have been resolved diplomatically, right?
Sure.
But that issue resonates in Russia. I mean, again, if we're thinking about support, that issue resonates in Russia. I mean, a huge part of kind of historical Russian sort of identity mentality is this opposition between Russia and the West, right? And the fact that the West does not respect Russia, right? And kind of NATO is being seen in that in the context, in that regard. Why Ukraine, was not admitted into NATO, cannot be admitted into NATO. I think it's the idea, of course, the core idea of NATO is that if one country is threatened, then everybody has to defend that country, and that would mean a direct confrontation with Russia, and of course, also the fact that Ukraine had so many issues, economic, corruption, which is why Zelensky became president, right? He became president because he promised to end corruption and to end war, the hostilities, the relationship, the bad relations with Russia, right? That was what brought him to power. With the European Union, again, it seems like, I think it might happen, right? Ukraine is now, it's kind of this speeded up process by which they can enter European Union. And they're already a candidate, right? And of course we saw that image, right, with Zelensky speaking to the European Parliament with everybody standing up, and when Lavrov, Russia's foreign minister, was speaking, everybody pretty much left the room. And I think joining the European Union, I don't know what that would mean militarily, but it certainly would mean a lot in terms of accepting refugees and economic aid and restoration of Ukraine. I mean, hopefully we'll come to that point when this will end and the country would need to be rebuilt.
And someone is asking if it's too late, if that, or do you think, I think someone is asking if it is too late, if acceptance is too late, and it's already that Ukraine's opinion of Europe is really going to alter so significantly that this could lead to other issues coming up. I don't know what you think about that thought.
Yeah, I mean, I hope not. I mean, Ukraine is certainly, Zelensky certainly demanding more, right? And now they've been talking a lot about closing the airspace, and now they're saying, if you're not willing to do that, because that would mean kind of a direct sort of a declaration of war to Russia on behalf of NATO. Said if you're not willing to do that, then give us warplanes, supply us those. I think the sense of solidarity with Ukraine is very genuine, and I think behind the scenes, there are some serious conversations being had about, what to do to stop this, and to help Ukraine. But these are very, very difficult conversations because, of course, we're dealing with a nuclear power that still has the largest, stockpiles of nuclear weapons. Essentially, where the decision, ruled as we see by ruthless autocrat intent on invading and destroying other countries. So it's a truly, truly serious situation.
Thank you, Marat. I will end by asking one last question and just thanking you profusely. I know that emotionally how difficult this is for you. Our hearts are with you and the people of Ukraine, and thank you so much. And I think the last question I'll just ask, and Amber, if you could put the address of the Federation program, the Jewish Federation in Portland is collecting money. 100% of what they're collecting is going directly to aid the people of Ukraine. What else can people listening in today do? Marat, do you have any other suggestions for us?
I think they should continue to pay as much attention to what is happening as possible. And, and support the American governments in the steps that it has taken. Continue paying attention, because it affects everybody. And I think educating yourself about that part of the world, where again there are just so many moving parts, Soviet, Ukrainian, Russian, Jewish, educating yourself. And and let's hope and pray that that this will not end catastrophically.
Yes, we are with you. So yesterday, Natan Meir from Portland State University also presented a program looking more at the history of Ukraine. Marat, we cannot thank you enough. We have such expertise in this community. We're grateful. Both of those programs were recorded. Our program has been recorded. Amber will have the recording out in a few hours for us. You'll be able to access the Federation recording on their website. So that will help us all to continue to stay informed. I'm so sorry I couldn't get to everybody's questions, but I want to thank you for the absolutely stellar, insightful questions that you asked today. Marat, thank you. Thank you so much. Everyone, take care. And as Marat said, let's all keep paying attention. Good afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Judy. And I should just
thank you so much.
If anybody, you're welcome to send me questions. You just go to the READ website. My email is easily found. And if interested in me speaking about this at other venues, please reach out to me.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.